Welcome to the debate. If you are listening to this right now in New York or London or Tokyo, there is a very good chance you view artificial intelligence with at least a mild sense of economic dread.
Yeah, the dominant narrative in the West is definitely that AI is coming for the white-collar jobs. It's threatening to upend the middle class and disrupt decades of established economic stability.
Exactly. But what if we completely flip the map? What if for the first time in modern history, the poorest countries in the world were actually better positioned to survive an industrial revolution than the richest?
It is a fascinating premise, and it's exactly what we're unpacking today. We are looking at a brand new, highly anticipated document, which is the World Bank's World Development Report 2026, The Promise of Artificial Intelligence.
Right, which was just published on August 4th, 2026.
Yeah, August 4th. And this isn't just another tech white paper. This is the institution's first truly comprehensive assessment of what AI means specifically for low and middle income countries.
And it raises a critical, incredibly urgent, central question that we will be tearing apart today. Can artificial intelligence truly act as a shortcut? A historical cheat code that allows developing nations to achieve a century of economic and social progress in a single decade? Or does this optimistic narrative ignore massive, fundamental infrastructure deficits threatening to widen the global divide rather than close it?
And just to be clear, today's discussion is grounded entirely in the findings, the hard data, and the rather stark warnings presented in this 2026 World Development Report.
Absolutely. I will argue that AI represents a realistic, unprecedented leapfrog opportunity for the Global South, provided a very pragmatic adoption strategy is used.
And I will argue that the fundamental prerequisites for AI make this shortcut narrative a dangerous illusion that actively distracts from systemic infrastructure needs.
Well, we are not talking about magic here. We are talking about highly leveraged technology arriving at exactly the right time.
Let's start with your view of that timing, actually, because you see this as a perfect convergence of technology and need, whereas I look at the same data and see a system being pushed to its absolute breaking point.
Well, consider the macroeconomic context the report lays out. The World Bank notes that developing economies are currently experiencing their weakest average economic growth in 3 decades.
Right. They're stalling out.
Exactly. They are stalling out. The traditional path of industrialization, building factories, shifting from agriculture to low-cost manufacturing, that is essentially blocked because global supply chains have already consolidated. They desperately need a new engine for growth. And then you look at the structural math presented in the report, which is highly, almost shockingly favorable to them.
You're referring to the automation risk metrics here?
I am. The report calculates that only 4.5% of jobs in developing nations are at risk of generative AI automation. Compare that to a staggering 14.2% in rich countries.
Wow, so almost a 10-point spread.
Yeah. The West is looking at massive labor displacement. The Global South is looking at an environment where their human labor force is largely insulated from the AI shock. Yet, the potential for significant productivity gains is nearly identical across the global divide.
Meaning what exactly?
Well, they project a 16.2% productivity boost in the Global South versus an 18.7% boost in the North. So the strategy the World Bank advocates isn't to build massive, costly, multi-billion-dollar foundation models from scratch. It's to apply existing AI to the back end of public administration, agriculture, and services.
Right.
We are already seeing real-world successes cited in the report, like Bangladesh utilizing AI to radically expand diabetes screening, or Peru proactively creating AI legal frameworks. It is a targeted, highly realistic path forward.
I look at that exact same structural math, and I come to a radically different conclusion. The entire concept of achieving a century of progress in a decade is fundamentally flawed from the ground up because it assumes the existence of the very physical infrastructure these developing countries so acutely lack.
Well, I wouldn't say it assumes it.
But you cannot run a digital revolution on a deficit of electricity. We have to look at the stark reality the report itself presents. In sub-Saharan Africa today, almost a third of rural schools lack reliable electricity. Over 2/3 lack reliable internet. How do you run advanced neural networks in the dark?
You don't run them in the dark, obviously, but you also don't need a server farm in every village.
But the environmental footprint of AI is inescapable. The massive electricity and water demands of these systems will aggressively punish regions where these basic resources are already scarce. My biggest fear, and a fear reflected in the subtext of the report, is that this shortcut narrative poses a severe political hazard.
Hazard how?
Because it tempts government leaders to cut vital investments in traditional physical infrastructure under the false, frankly dangerous belief that AI will magically solve foundational deficit.
Let me jump in right there, because I really want to drill down into that 4.5% automation risk figure. You seem to view it as just a mere statistic, but I see it as a historical anomaly that completely changes the rules of development.
How so?
Because for the first time, developing nations are uniquely positioned to reap the rewards of an industrial revolution without suffering the social upheaval that wealthier nations are about to face. They get the upside, that 16.2% productivity boost we talked about, without the catastrophic downside of mass unemployment.
Yeah, I have to stop you there, because I just don't buy the premise that this is some sort of protective shield. That 4.5% figure isn't an advantage. It is a glaring symptom of their underlying structural fragility.
Wait, how is low automation risk a fragility?
Because of why it's low. The reason the automation risk sits at 4.5% is precisely because these economies rely predominantly on manual, agricultural, and low-skill physical service jobs. A large language model cannot pick coffee beans. A generative AI cannot pour concrete or lay bricks.
Sure, but
If the vast majority of your workforce is engaged in intense physical labor without basic digital access, how on earth can artificial intelligence significantly boost productivity in those specific sectors? You're basically offering a highly sophisticated digital solution to an entirely analog reality.
I see why you think that. I really do, because we are so conditioned to think of AI as a tool for knowledge workers. You know, lawyers writing briefs or programmers writing code. But let me give you a different perspective on how technology actually permeates an economy. You don't need a robot picking the coffee beans to revolutionize agricultural productivity. I want you to think back to the telecommunications revolution.
You mean the mobile phone leapfrog?
Exactly. In the 90s and 2000s, developing nations in Africa and Southeast Asia didn't spend decades laying copper landline wire to every single remote village. They leapfrogged that entirely. They went straight to mobile cellular networks. The AI moment we are in right now operates on the exact same logic of leapfrogging.
I understand the analogy, I do, but it has a massive hole in it. A mobile phone in a remote village still requires a cell tower to connect to, and that cell tower requires a reliable power grid.
It does, but it requires significantly less distributed point-to-point physical infrastructure than the legacy systems of the West. You don't have to dig a trench to every single house. And AI is even more flexible. Let's look at the India example highlighted in the World Bank report.
Okay.
India has a massive agricultural sector reliant on manual labor, exactly as you described. But they are currently using AI-driven weather forecasting to lower costs and dramatically improve crop decisions for smallhold farmers.
But how does the farmer actually interface with that AI if they don't have a smartphone or broadband?
That is the absolute beauty of it. The farmers themselves do not need expensive local hardware or massive data centers or even advanced digital literacy. The AI operates entirely on the back end.
Meaning what, practically?
It ingests massive amounts of complex satellite imagery, historical weather patterns, and microclimate soil data. It processes all of that on a server thousands of miles away and then delivers a simple, highly targeted, actionable insight via SMS to a basic feature phone.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it might just text the farmer, wait 3 days to plant the seeds because a localized frost is coming. The productivity gain, that 16.2%, isn't about replacing the farmer with a machine. It's about optimizing the environment around the manual labor. It makes the human exponentially more efficient.
Okay, that is a fantastic example of a localized end-user application. I'll give you that. But you just glossed over the heaviest part of your own explanation. You said it processes all of that on a server thousands of miles away.
Yes.
Have you considered the macro-level back-end requirements needed to run those systems globally? Indermit Gill, the World Bank chief economist, explicitly stated in the release of this report that countries don't need large data centers to reap AI's benefits. He framed AI adoption almost as this floating lifeline, but that fundamentally ignores the physics of artificial intelligence.
Actually, I think it respects the physics by centralizing the hardest parts.
No, It externalizes the physics, which creates a massive new dependency. We throw around terms like compute clusters and foundation models, but let's visualize what that actually means. A foundation model is the massive underlying brain of the AI, like the core technology behind ChatGPT.
Right.
Building and running these requires compute clusters, which are essentially giant warehouses the size of several football fields, packed floor to ceiling with specialized processors. These processors run so incredibly hot that they require millions of gallons of fresh water just to avoid melting down, not to mention gigawatts of electricity. The models built in the US and China, the ones these developing nations are supposed to rely on, have astronomical energy demands.
But that's exactly why developing nations shouldn't build them. They just connect to them.
Connect to them how? Usually through an API, right? An application programming interface?
Yes.
It's basically a digital bridge where an app in India sends a request over the internet to a server in California. The server does the heavy thinking and sends the answer back. But even if a country is just adopting a model through an API, that basic adoption still requires robust local connectivity to send the request and a stable local power grid to keep the local hospital or government office online, plus immense institutional bandwidth.
It does require connectivity, yes, but
When a third of rural schools in sub-Saharan Africa don't have electricity and 2/3 don't have internet, the back end isn't just a bottleneck, it is a brick wall.
That is a very real challenge, though I would frame the World Bank's response to it differently. The report isn't ignoring the infrastructure gap. They are proposing a highly specific, very realistic methodology to navigate around the worst of it. The report outlines what they call the adopt, adapt, advance strategy. And I actually think this is a brilliant direct critique of a very toxic idea that's been floating around global politics lately, the concept of technological sovereignty.
You mean the idea that every nation needs its own homegrown AI to be secure?
Precisely. For the last 2 years, the narrative has been that every country needs to spend billions to build its own massive compute clusters to compete on the global stage. The World Bank is stepping in and explicitly saying, no, do not do that. Developing nations are not being asked to compete with OpenAI or Google or DeepSeek.
Right.
They are being advised to take the adopt, adapt, advance route. You adopt the existing pre-trained foundation models from the West or Asia. Then you adapt them, meaning you train them on local languages, local cultural contexts, and local institutional guidelines. And then you advance from there by deploying them into public services.
I see.
It drastically lowers the barrier to entry. It shifts the focus away from pouring concrete for billion-dollar hardware facilities and focuses entirely on creating agile, localized software adaptations.
Well, I will certainly concede that adapting a pre-existing model is vastly cheaper than building a new one from scratch. But in championing this strategy, you are glossing over a massive, flashing red warning light right in the middle of this report.
Which one?
The World Bank explicitly warns that there is currently a severe lack of rigorous evidence for selecting and evaluating these AI applications in the public sector.
Well, because it's new. All technologies lack rigorous evidence in their first few years of deployment.
Yes, but adapting an AI to help with public health triage or judicial sentencing requires intense localized evaluation because the stakes are quite literally life and death. If governments in the global south do not have the institutional capacity or the highly trained data scientists to rigorously test these adopted models, they are flying completely blind. We are talking about deploying hallucination-prone systems into critical areas.
Let's quickly define hallucination in this context for clarity.
Sure. A hallucination in AI is when the system confidently makes up a completely false fact because it fundamentally doesn't understand the real world. It only understands statistical word patterns. In a chatbot, a hallucination is funny, but if you integrate a hallucinating AI into Bangladesh's diabetes screening program, which you brought up earlier, a misdiagnosis doesn't just lower a national productivity metric, it costs a human life.
You are right to highlight the gravity of the stakes, absolutely. The lack of rigorous evidence is a current reality, but it is not a permanent state, and we have to view the risk in context.
I'd argue the Bangladesh example in the report is actually the perfect counterargument to your fear.
How so?
The volume of diabetes screening in Bangladesh increased drastically precisely because the AI tools were integrated into the public health system. Yes, they used an AI system on basic, cheap smartphones to take retinal scans and triage patients who might have diabetic retinopathy. Is a newly adapted AI triage system perfect? Absolutely not. Will it occasionally make a mistake? Yes, but we have to compare it to the baseline in these developing regions.
Which is what, exactly?
The baseline is often a complete and utter absence of public service. The alternative to an AI screening a patient isn't a world-class human endocrinologist screening them. The alternative is the patient never being screened at all until they go blind. The AI provides a baseline of capability where none existed. It is a massive net positive for public health, even with the margins of error.
That's a fair point on public health. But this brings us to what I consider the most dangerous aspect of this entire report: the political hazards of the lifeline narrative. When a highly respected, heavily influential institution like the World Bank tells the world that AI can achieve a century of progress in a decade, politicians listen. And unfortunately, they hear exactly what they want to hear.
Meaning they hear, oh, here's a cheap solution.
Exactly. Labeling AI as an easy shortcut gives political leaders a very dangerous excuse to justify deep cuts in essential traditional infrastructure. Put yourself in the shoes of a finance minister in a developing nation. You have a limited budget. You look at a proposal and argue, well, why should we invest billions in a traditional, slow-moving power grid, or hundreds of brick-and-mortar schools, or train thousands of human teachers, when the World Bank says AI is the future?
The report doesn't say AI replaces those things.
It doesn't matter what the footnotes say. It matters what the headline implies to a politician looking to save money. The report explicitly states that AI functions on top of a foundational base of electricity and connectivity, not as a replacement for it.
Right, yes.
If governments divert funds away from the physical grid to chase the digital AI ghost, the adoption will be highly catastrophically unequal. It will create a one-way highway for the urban elite who already have stable power and broadband, leaving the most vulnerable rural populations permanently behind. It exacerbates the exact divide it claims to close.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it assumes the World Bank is issuing a blank check for complacency. The message of the report, which was guided by Director Gaurav Nayar, is the exact opposite of an excuse to cut infrastructure.
Is it, though?
Yes, he explicitly warns that the margin to get it right is narrow. This is a conditional shortcut. It only materializes if governments act with absolute urgency to close those structural gaps while simultaneously adopting the software.
But doing both simultaneously requires a level of fiscal and institutional capacity that we've already established is largely missing. If the margin to get it right is narrow, and the prerequisite is flawless parallel execution of advanced AI integration and basic infrastructure rollout, that doesn't sound like a shortcut at all. That sounds like a tightrope walk in a hurricane.
It is incredibly difficult, yes. But it is happening right now. I would point to Peru, which the report highlights as a primary successful case study.
What is Peru doing differently?
They didn't wait to have perfect, ubiquitous physical infrastructure before addressing the AI revolution. They are proactively laying down the institutional and legal frameworks right now.
Oh, I see.
They are creating data privacy laws, algorithmic accountability standards, and public procurement rules for AI. They are preparing the regulatory ground so that as the physical infrastructure, the broadband and the power grids, improves, the digital integration can happen safely and seamlessly.
Right.
They recognize that AI depends heavily on local context. The internet protocol was universal, right? An email works the same in Lima as it does in London. But AI requires localized adaptation. It needs to know local laws, local dialects, local customs to be safe. Peru is proving that you can begin the adapt phase of the strategy right now, even while you build the power plants.
Peru's legal framework is commendable. Truly, it is good governance. But a law on the books doesn't power a server. A robust data privacy policy doesn't give a rural student a tablet with internet access. The risk of widening the global gap is not a theoretical footnote in this report. It is a central, looming threat.
But
Those who already have the energy, the connectivity, and the strong institutions will capture that 16.2% productivity gain instantly. Those who don't will not just stay where they are, they will fall exponentially further behind because the baseline of global economic competitiveness will have shifted overnight.
That is exactly why this World Bank report is so vital. It is sounding the alarm before that gap becomes unbridgeable. I think it's probably time we synthesize where we've arrived in this discussion.
Agreed.
From my perspective, the 2026 report clearly demonstrates that while the infrastructural hurdles are undeniably immense, the targeted Adopt, Adapt, Advance strategy provides an unprecedented data-backed opportunity. We are looking at a scenario where developing nations can drastically improve public services, like deploying SMS weather alerts to farmers in India or cheap smartphone retinal scans in Bangladesh, without the severe job automation risks facing the West. But it requires governments to seize a very narrow, rapidly closing window of time.
And to synthesize my position, without resolving the foundational systemic crises of electricity, connectivity, and institutional rigor, AI will simply bypass the most vulnerable populations on Earth. The narrative of a century and a decade risks becoming a political distraction rather than an economic savior. It threatens to exacerbate the digital divide by masking the desperate, unglamorous need for basic physical infrastructure. You just can't leapfrog the need for power.
Despite our disagreements on the feasibility of the timeline, I think we can both agree on a few crucial points of convergence drawn directly from the World Bank's assessment. First, the window for action is indeed extremely narrow. The technology is evolving faster than any previous general-purpose technology in human history.
Yes.
And second, AI relies heavily on local context, so language, culture, and institutions, to be effective and safe.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we certainly agree that simply downloading an AI model without making massive foundational investments in power, connectivity, and human capital will entirely fail. The sheer complexity of this report is what makes it so important to dissect. We cannot simply accept the flashy century and a decade headline at face value without interrogating the underlying mechanics of how these systems actually function in the real world.
Exactly. It requires looking past the optimism of the headlines to understand the highly conditional nature of this technological promise. We suggest that you, the listener, examine your own region's readiness regardless of where you live. Look at your local energy grid, the state of your digital education, and the strength of the institutional frameworks in your country.
Right. Ask yourself if the physical and legal groundwork for this conditional shortcut is actually being laid, or if your leaders are just hoping for a digital miracle. Because if we go back to the idea of a shortcut, a tunnel through a mountain is a marvel of engineering, but only if you've done the hard work to reinforce the walls. If we aren't actually building the physical and institutional supports for this passage, we aren't creating a shortcut to the future at all. We might just be painting a doorway on the side of a mountain, expecting to walk right through it.
A sobering and powerful image to end on. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.